Have you ever witnessed a love so powerful that it defied time, distance, and even pain? A bond so unbreakable that even when torn apart, it refused to fade? Today, on Veil Marks, we bring you a story that will stay with you long after the final scene. A story of loyalty, loss, and a love that never gave up. What would you do if the one you loved most in this world was ripped away in an instant, leaving only silence in their place? Would you wait? Would you search? Would you hold on to hope, even when the world tells you to let go? This isn't just a tale about a dog. It's about faith, resilience, and the kind of love that refuses to be forgotten. Stay with us until the very end, because this story holds a message deeper than words. And when it's over, tell us, what would you have done if you were Rex? Luna remembered everything. Some memories fade over time, slipping away like autumn leaves carried by the wind. But not this one. This one stayed, sharp, vivid, a wound that never healed, forever etched into her soul, the clang of metal, the sudden shuddering slam of the truck door. The sound was final, like a coffin lid sealing shut. The air inside the cage was thick, suffocating, heavy with the stench of rust and gasoline. Luna's paws trembled against the metal bars, her body curled into itself as panic began to coil inside her chest. This wasn't a bad dream. This wasn't a mistake. She had been taken. Just moments ago, she had been outside. The world had still been warm, the evening air filled with the lingering scent of Arthur's old coat, with the rich smell of the soil beneath her paws, with the comforting presence of Rex by her side. And now there was only cold steel. A lump formed in her throat as she forced herself to lift her head. The cage was small, too small. She could barely turn, barely move. She pressed her nose to the narrow gap between the bars, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. And that's when she saw him. Rex. He was still there, still at home, still behind the fence. His ears stood erect, his body tense, his dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she had never seen before. It was wrong. It was all wrong. Rex never looked like that. He was the strong one, the steady one, the protector, the one who always watched over her, who always made things okay. But now, he looked helpless. His tail was stiff, his legs braced as if he were ready to spring forward, to tear through the barrier between them. Luna felt a sob rise in her throat, but no sound came out. She tried to bark, to call to him, to tell him she was here, but the truck was already moving. The rumble of the engine swallowed her voice. The vibration of the tires sent a shudder through the cage, rattling her bones. She pressed harder against the bars, straining her neck, willing time to slow down, willing the truck to stop. She saw him lunge. Rex slammed his paws against the fence, his bark cutting through the thick, humid air. Deep. Commanding. A sound that had always meant safety, strength, home. But there was no safety now. The fence didn't break. The truck didn't stop. And she was leaving him behind. A sharp, aching whimper tore from her throat as she watched his form grow smaller. His muscles tensed, his body coiled like a spring about to snap. He wanted to chase her. He needed to. But he couldn't. The distance between them widened. The house, the fence, Rex, everything was shrinking, slipping away. Number. This wasn't happening. She threw herself against the cage, claws scraping against metal, muscles burning as she fought against the prison that held her. She twisted, pushed, pulled, anything to get out, anything to go back. She barked, a desperate, frantic cry. Rex! The word wasn't one he could understand, but he knew. His body was still, locked in place like a statue. But his eyes followed her, never breaking away, never losing focus. It was a look that spoke without words, a look that screamed, "I won't let you go," a look that begged, "Come back," a look that held on to her, even as the truck turned onto the main road and the last piece of Rex disappeared from sight. Luna's body sagged. She collapsed onto the cold floor of the cage, chest heaving, her ears straining for the sound of his bark. But there was only the hum of the tires on the pavement, only the rhythmic bounce of the truck moving farther and farther away. Her world had shattered. She had always thought nothing could separate them, that no force on earth could pull them apart. They had grown up together, played together, slept curled up against each other, their bodies pressed close for warmth during winter nights. Rex had always been there, always, and now, for the first time, he wasn't. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing herself into the corner of the cage as if she could will herself to disappear, to wake up back home, to hear Arthur's old boots shuffling on the porch, to feel Rex's steady heartbeat against her side. Instead, there was only emptiness, a void so deep it swallowed her whole. The men outside were talking, their voices distant and unimportant. She didn't care what they were saying. She didn't care where they were taking her. Nothing mattered. Everything she had ever known, everything she had ever loved, was gone. A single thought pounded through her mind, over and over, drowning out the noise, drowning out the fear. I have to go back. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but she knew one thing. As long as there was breath in her lungs, she would not be lost forever. And somewhere, back in that yard, Rex was thinking the exact same thing, waiting, hoping, calling for her. And for the first time in her life, Luna had no way to answer. The moment the truck came to a stop, Luna felt the shift in the air. The rumble of the tires ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence. It wasn't the kind of silence she had known at home, the peaceful stillness of an evening spent lying beside Rex. This was different. This was heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then the door of the truck creaked open. Bright, artificial light spilled in, burning her eyes. A strong, filthy hand gripped the latch of her cage, jerking it open with a loud clang. The stench of sweat and metal filled her nostrils. She barely had a moment to react before rough hands grabbed her scruff and yanked her out. The impact of hitting the cold concrete sent a jolt of pain through her body. Luna let out a sharp yelp, her paws scrambling for balance as her nails scraped against the floor. The grip on her tightened, fingers digging into her fur, dragging her forward, her ears pinned back. Everything in her screamed to fight, to resist, to run. But where would she go? The moment she looked up, she realized there was nowhere to escape. The air here was different, thick, oily. It carried the scent of fear, of unwashed bodies, of sweat and old blood, a putrid mix that coated her throat, making it hard to breathe. Then she heard them, low growls, whimpers, heavy panting. She turned her head and saw them, rows of cages stacked haphazardly, some rusted, others dented from the force of struggling bodies slamming against them. And inside, dogs, not like the ones she had known in the park, the ones who wagged their tails and sniffed the air with curiosity. These were different. Their eyes were wild, sunken, full of something raw and desperate. Some were pressed against the backs of their cages, trembling, while others paced restlessly, their movements jittery and tense. Some weren't moving at all. Luna's breath hitched. The man dragging her forward yanked on the thick rope tied around her neck. It tightened, making her cough, forcing her to stumble forward. They were taking her deeper. The hallway was long, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead. The further they went, the stronger the scent of blood became. It wasn't fresh. It was old, soaked into the very walls. Luna's paws faltered. She didn't want to go any further. She pulled back, planting her paws against the ground, trying to resist. The man cursed and gave a sharp tug. The rope bit into her throat. Her vision blurred. Her legs gave out. With one last pull, she was shoved into a corner of a dimly lit holding area, her back slamming against the cold, damp wall. A heavy chain clicked around her neck, locking her in place. And then, they left her. Luna gasped for air, her body shaking. She wasn't alone. There were others. To her left, a large dog with patchy fur and deep scars along his back lay curled up, his ribs stark against his skin. His breathing was slow, ragged. His tail didn't wag, his eyes didn't even open. To her right, a smaller dog, barely more than a pup, pressed itself against the bars of its cage, trembling so hard its entire body shook. Luna swallowed hard. What was this place? The door creaked again. Footsteps. Someone new entered. Luna shrank back, her ears flattening as she braced for whatever would come next. But then she heard a voice. Rough, deep, scratched raw from years of use. "If you don't fight, they'll get rid of you." Luna turned her head sharply. A pair of tired amber eyes met hers. The voice belonged to a massive Pitbull, his coat once a rich brown, but now faded and marred with thick scars. His ears were torn, his muzzle traced with old wounds. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They weren't just tired, they were resigned. He had seen this before. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The old Pitbull exhaled through his nose, watching her carefully. "They'll throw you in, whether you like it or not," he continued, his voice low, matter of fact. "And if you don't fight, they'll make an example of you." Luna's stomach clenched. She didn't understand. Not fully, but she knew enough to be afraid. Her throat was dry. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a broken whimper. "I don't want to fight," she finally managed. A muscle in the old dog's jaw twitched. "None of us did." Luna's heart pounded against her ribs. She wanted to tell him this was a mistake, that she had a home, that her best friend was waiting for her, that she just had to get back. But the words wouldn't come. The old Pitbull let out a long, slow breath and finally looked away. His silence told her everything. This wasn't a mistake, and no one was coming to save her. The first time they dragged Luna into the ring, she didn't understand what was happening. Her paws skidded against the rough concrete floor as two men yanked her forward, their grips bruising against her fur. The air was thick with the pungent scent of sweat and blood, a stench that clung to the very walls. Overhead, dim, buzzing lights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the makeshift arena. The noise was deafening, men shouting, the sharp clang of metal gates slamming shut, and worst of all, the guttural growls of dogs who had long forgotten what it meant to be afraid. Luna's heart pounded wildly as she was shoved into the center of the ring. The chain around her neck was unlatched, the heavy links falling away with a sharp clink against the floor. She barely had time to catch her breath before she saw him. A dog. No, a prisoner. Just like her. He was lean, ribs showing through a coat that had once been sleek, but was now matted with dirt and old wounds. His ears were torn, one eye swollen shut. He trembled as he stood across from her, muscles tight, tail tucked low. Luna swallowed hard. This wasn't a game. A whistle blew. The men around them roared. The dog flinched, his gaze darting to the figures standing just beyond the cage. His breaths came fast and shallow, and then he lunged. Luna barely dodged in time. She felt the rush of air as his jaws snapped shut inches from her face. Her heart screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She spun, paws scrambling against the slick concrete, and saw the men outside the cage watching her with cold, expectant eyes. Some leaned forward, money exchanging hands, voices rising in cruel anticipation. Luna turned back just in time to see the dog charge again, but this time she didn't move. She planted her paws firmly against the ground and squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. The other dog hesitated. His growl wavered. His eyes, wild with hunger and fear, locked onto hers. For a brief second, Luna saw something in them, something human. He didn't want this either, but before either of them could react, something struck Luna hard from behind. A boot. She yelped as pain shot up her ribs. The voices around them turned sharp, angry. One of the men barked an order. "Fight, or you both die!" Luna's breath came in short gasps. Her legs shook. The dog in front of her, he was shaking too. They were both trapped. The dog let out a sharp bark, his body tensing once more. But he didn't lunge this time. He waited. Luna's chest tightened. He was giving her a choice. She could attack first. She could strike, sink her teeth into his flesh, earn herself another day of survival, or she could refuse and suffer the consequences. She lowered her head and took a step back. The crowd exploded into angry shouts. Luna braced herself. The next blow came fast. A heavy rod slammed against her side, sending her sprawling onto the cold floor. A sharp cry escaped her throat as pain flared through her body. She barely had time to react before the boot returned, kicking her hard against the ribs. Luna curled in on herself, ears pinned flat, tail tucked so tightly against her stomach that she could feel her own heartbeat racing against her fur. The blows kept coming, a fist, a rod, boots against her side, and then nothing. Silence. Luna's body shuddered, her breath hitching in painful gasps. Her vision blurred as she tried to lift her head. The men had lost interest. The fight was over before it even began. She had failed them, and for that, she would suffer. The next few days blurred together in a haze of hunger and pain. No food, no water, only darkness and the weight of exhaustion pressing against her bones. She lay curled in the corner of her cage, too weak to lift her head. Her body ached in places she didn't even know could hurt. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a soft voice. "Kid." She barely stirred. A sigh. The sound of shifting chains. "Bruno." "You're lucky," he muttered. Luna swallowed. Her throat was dry, raw. "How?" "They didn't kill you," Bruno said flatly. Luna closed her eyes. She almost wished they had. Bruno was quiet for a moment before he spoke again, his voice low. "That dog you were supposed to fight? He didn't make it." Luna's eyes snapped open. Bruno turned his head toward her. His face was unreadable. "They put him in another match, against someone who would fight back." Luna's stomach twisted violently. She thought about the way he had hesitated, the way he had given her a chance, and she had let him down. Bruno exhaled heavily. "Don't get attached," he said simply. She felt his words like a weight in her chest. Bruno had been here too long. He had seen too much, and now she was starting to understand why. The days passed. She watched. She listened. Dogs went in, and some never came back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the door to their holding area swung open. 2 men entered. Their eyes locked onto Bruno. He didn't flinch. Luna's breath hitched. They unchained him. He didn't fight them, didn't struggle. He only turned his head slightly, his amber eyes finding hers in the dim light, and then he was gone. Luna waited. Hours passed, but he never came back. She curled up tighter, pressing herself against the cold, unyielding floor. Bruno had tried to warn her, and now he was gone. She wasn't going to be next. The next time they dragged her into the ring, she didn't hesitate. She stood tall, paws firm against the ground, ears pricked forward. Her body still ached, but her spirit, her will, was alive. The whistle blew. A dog charged. Luna ducked, twisting out of the way. She felt the rush of air as jaws snapped where her throat had been just seconds before. She moved. She struck. Not to kill, not to destroy, but to survive. Because she had made a choice. She would not become what they wanted her to be. But she would not die here. Not like Bruno. Not like the others. Somewhere out there, beyond these walls, beyond the blood-stained floors, Rex was waiting for her, and she was going to find him. No matter what it took. The night was thick with tension. The air inside the warehouse was stale, heavy with the scent of damp concrete, rusted metal, and old blood. The only sounds were the muffled whimpers of caged dogs, the occasional clang of chains as one of them shifted in restless fear, and the low murmur of voices from the men who ran this place. Luna lay curled in the corner of her enclosure, her ribs rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her body ached, bruises forming beneath her fur, her muscles too weak to move. She had stopped counting the days. There was no point. Time didn't exist in this place. There was only hunger, pain, and the endless cycle of survival. Somewhere in the darkness, a deep growl echoed. It was distant, coming from one of the larger holding areas where the more aggressive dogs were kept. Luna flinched, her ears twitching, but she didn't lift her head. She had no energy left to be afraid. Then, suddenly, everything changed. The first sound came like a thunderclap in the stillness, a sharp, piercing siren. Luna's eyes shot open. More sounds followed, shouting, heavy boots slamming against concrete, the metallic rattle of cages being forced open. Then came the worst of it, gunshots. The crack of a weapon firing shattered the night, sending a ripple of panic through the air. Dogs barked wildly, some snarling, others whimpering in terror. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Luna pressed herself against the cold wall, her ears flattened against her skull. Through the gaps in her enclosure, she saw men running, their faces no longer filled with arrogance but panic. One of them yanked open a side door and bolted into the darkness. Another tried to grab a weapon, but a voice from outside boomed, "Drop it! Hands where I can see them!" The man hesitated, then threw his hands up just as a group of officers stormed inside. More shots, more shouting. The warehouse, once filled with the cruel laughter of men who thrived on suffering, was now a battlefield. Luna's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She didn't know what was happening. She only knew that everything was loud, everything was moving, and she was too weak to run. A loud crash shook the ground as someone kicked over a stack of metal crates. The impact sent one of the cage doors swinging open, and then the locks began to break. Dogs burst from their enclosures, some running blindly into the chaos, others snarling at the men who had kept them in chains. The sharp scent of adrenaline filled the air as bodies collided, claws scraped against the floor, and barks turned into battle cries. Luna tried to move. Her legs refused. She was too weak. Her body trembled as she forced herself to stand, her paws slipping against the floor. Her vision blurred. The room spun. Somewhere nearby, she saw a flash of movement, a dog lunging at one of the men. A gun clattered to the ground. Someone screamed. Luna stumbled forward. The warehouse door was open now. The night air spilled in, cold and fresh, carrying with it a promise of freedom. Dogs rushed past her, bodies blurring as they disappeared into the darkness beyond. She took a step toward it, just one. Her legs gave out. She collapsed. She didn't have the strength to fight, not anymore. Her breath hitched as she curled in on herself, pressing against the floor, hoping, praying that no one would notice her in the chaos. Then, a voice. Software. Gentle. Hey, I got one over here." Footsteps. The scent of something clean, soap, fabric softener, something that didn't belong in a place like this. Luna barely registered the presence moving toward her. She felt hands, but they weren't rough like the ones that had shoved her into cages, that had yanked chains tight around her throat. These hands were careful, warm, safe. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on her fragile form. A man knelt beside her, his voice hushed but urgent. "She's in bad shape," he murmured. Another voice, a woman's, responded. "Can she stand?" The man touched her lightly, running his fingers over the curve of her spine. Luna flinched but didn't have the strength to move away. "She's barely breathing. We need to get her out now." Luna tried to lift her head. The world swam. Her ears rang. The man hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. "Forget the carrier. She won't last." "I'm carrying her." Strong arms slid beneath her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't being dragged or shoved or chained. She was being held. The man cradled her gently as he stood. She felt his heartbeat against her side, steady and sure, a sound she hadn't heard since Rex. He turned toward the door, moving swiftly. The cold air hit her face as they stepped outside. The night stretched out beyond them, vast and endless. For a moment, Luna thought she was dreaming. She had forgotten what outside felt like, what fresh air smelled like, what it meant to be free. Her eyes fluttered shut. The man's voice was distant now, speaking to someone, urgent, but calm. "We need to get her to the rescue center, now." Luna's mind drifted. The voices blurred. The stars above, scattered across the sky, seemed so far away. But she had made it out. She was alive. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. And somewhere, far away, in a place she could no longer see, Rex was still waiting for her. The shelter was quiet at night. The soft hum of ceiling fans stirred the stale air, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Most of the dogs had settled into an uneasy sleep, their bodies curled on thin blankets, their breath slow and steady. But not Rex. Rex never slept at this hour. Instead, he lay awake, his large, muscular body stretched across the cold floor of his kennel, his ears pricked toward a world beyond the bars. His deep brown eyes, filled with something ancient and aching, stared at nothing. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, his head lifted, his muscles tensed, his ears twitched, and then, at exactly 10:17 p.m., a sound broke the silence. A low, trembling whimper. It wasn't the kind of whimper that came from hunger or discomfort. It wasn't the sharp bark of a dog seeking attention. It was something else. A call. A cry from deep within his soul. Every night, without fail, at this exact moment, Rex would release this soft, sorrowful sound. And every night, the shelter staff would pause, listening, feeling a pang of something unexplainable settle in their chests. No one knew why he did it. Not at first. But Jessica Morgan had seen too much in her years working with rescue dogs to believe it was just a coincidence. Rex wasn't just waiting, he was remembering. And he was holding on to something that no one else could see. Jessica had been watching Rex for weeks. She had seen dogs mourn before, seen them refuse food for days after losing an owner, seen them retreat into themselves after suffering abuse. But this was different. Rex wasn't just grieving. He was waiting. And the time mattered. She had heard the staff whispering about it, how it was always the same, 10:17 p.m. down to the second. Why? Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that there was a missing piece, something they hadn't uncovered. So she dug deeper. She requested Rex's intake file, scanning every detail, searching for anything that might explain his behavior. His records were sparse, found at a deceased owner's residence, no other pets present. But something about that note made her pause. No other pets present. Had there been one before? She flipped through more reports. Police logs, witness statements, anything she could find from the day Rex had been brought in. Then she found it. A neighbor's report, 10:17 a.m. That was the time authorities had recorded a mysterious truck leaving the property. Jessica's pulse quickened. She read the line again, her fingers tightening around the page. A large vehicle was seen departing at 10:17 a.m. No other animals were found on site. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. Rex wasn't just howling out of grief. He was remembering the exact moment he lost someone they hadn't found, someone they had assumed wasn't there. But Rex knew the truth. He had known all along. The next evening, Jessica sat outside Rex's kennel, watching him as the minutes ticked toward the inevitable. 10:15 p.m. Rex's body was still, but there was an energy beneath his skin, a tension in his shoulders. His tail twitched once, then stilled. His breath came slower, deeper. 10:16 p.m. Jessica leaned forward, barely breathing. Then 10:17 p.m. Rex lifted his head. His ears twitched. His nostrils flared. And then that same soft, heartbreaking whimper. Jessica swallowed hard. She had seen enough. Rex wasn't just mourning his owner. He was mourning someone else. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do. She had to find out who. The next morning, Jessica made her way to the storage area where the shelter kept blankets and donated dog items. Rex had been given the same blanket since the day he arrived, a tattered old piece of fabric that he never let go of. Something told her to check. She lifted the blanket carefully, running her fingers over its rough texture. It smelled like him. Earthy, warm, comforting. And then, beneath the folds, something small and metallic glinted in the dim light. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. A collar. Faded. Worn. The pink leather darkened by time, but still intact. A small metal tag dangled from it, scratched but legible. Luna. Jessica felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She turned back toward Rex, who was now watching her from his kennel. She swallowed and took a step closer, kneeling just outside the bars. Then she did something she had never done before. She whispered, "Luna." Rex's body went rigid. His ears shot up, his eyes wide and alert. Jessica watched, stunned, as his tail gave a single, desperate wag, not of happiness, but of recognition. He knew the name. Jessica's fingers tightened around the collar. This was it. This was the proof she needed. Luna wasn't just a name on an old collar. Luna was real. And if she was real, where was she now? Jessica had one more thing to do. If she was right, if Luna was out there somewhere, alive, waiting, lost just like Rex, then there was only one way to be sure. She had to find her, and she had to see what happened when Luna saw this collar again. Hours later, Jessica pulled into the driveway of a rescue center 2 counties away, the one that had just taken in a Pitbull with no identification, no microchip, and a history no one could trace. Jessica walked in slowly, her fingers wrapped tightly around the collar in her pocket. A volunteer led her down a quiet hallway, past rows of kennels. The dogs inside stirred, some watching her curiously, others too exhausted to react. And then, at the very end of the row, she saw her. Luna. Thin. Scarred. Her once bright coat dulled by hardship. But it was her. Jessica barely had time to process it before she took a slow step forward. She pulled the collar from her pocket and crouched just outside Luna's cage. Then, in a soft whisper, she said the name. Luna. For a second, nothing happened. Then, Luna's body tensed, her head lifted, her ears twitched, and then, as if a switch had flipped inside her, she surged forward. She whimpered, then cried, a soft, broken sound of recognition, of longing, of something lost being found again. Jessica exhaled shakily, blinking back the sting of tears. There was no doubt anymore. Rex hadn't just been waiting, he had been calling, and finally, someone had answered. Jessica gripped the small, faded collar in her hand as she stepped through the doors of the rescue center. The air inside was cool, carrying the familiar scent of antiseptic and clean blankets. The muffled sounds of dogs stirring in their kennels filled the space, but she barely heard them. Her heart pounded. She had spent weeks following leads, searching, hoping. She had seen the look in Rex's eyes every night at 10:17 p.m., heard the sorrow in his voice, felt the weight of his loss. And now, standing just a few feet away from a steel kennel at the end of the row, she knew. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. She took a steady breath and crouched down, pressing her fingers against the cold metal bars. The dog inside didn't move at first. Luna? The name slipped from her lips in barely more than a whisper, yet it shattered the silence. The dog, curled in the farthest corner of the kennel, froze. Jessica's breath caught. Luna was thin, her ribs faintly visible beneath her dull, scarred coat. Her ears twitched, her body stiff. Then, she lifted her head. Her nose twitched. A shiver ran through her frame as she inhaled something familiar in the air. Jessica's fingers tightened around the old leather collar. Slowly, carefully, she pulled it from her pocket and held it out where Luna could see it. The tiny metal tag glinted under the fluorescent light, scratched but still legible. Luna. Jessica barely had time to process what happened next. Luna moved. Her body, weak from weeks of suffering, suddenly surged forward. Her paws scrambled against the floor, nails clicking frantically as she lunged toward the bars. A high-pitched, desperate whimper tore from her throat. Jessica inhaled sharply, eyes stinging. Luna pressed her face against the cage, her nose bumping against the collar in Jessica's hand. Then, as if realizing it was real, that it was hers, she let out a broken cry and buried her face into it, nuzzling, breathing, clinging to the last piece of home she had left. Jessica's throat tightened. Tears burned behind her eyes as she watched the dog tremble, as she listened to the quiet, aching whimpers that spoke of recognition, relief, longing. She reached through the bars, gently, cautiously, and pressed a hand against Luna's muzzle. "You're going home," she whispered. Luna shuddered beneath her touch. Then, for the first time in weeks, her tail wagged. Jessica drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the passenger seat where Luna lay curled on a soft blanket. The rescue center had been hesitant. Luna needed more time to recover, more rest, more treatment. But Jessica knew. Luna didn't need more time. She needed him. She needed Rex. The shelter came into view, its dimly lit parking lot casting long shadows across the pavement. Jessica pulled in, cutting the engine. Luna stirred, lifting her head. Her body was still weak, but something had changed. She knew this place. Jessica gently unbuckled her seatbelt, reaching over to stroke Luna's side. "Come on, girl," she murmured. "He's waiting for you." She barely had time to open the door before Luna pushed herself up, paws trembling, tail flicking anxiously. She helped her onto the ground, steadying her. Luna's legs wobbled, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the shelter entrance. She knew. Jessica swallowed, feeling her own breath hitch. She had witnessed rescues before. She had seen dogs find new homes, new families. But this was different. This was a reunion that had defied time, distance, and the darkest depths of suffering. This was two souls finding their way back to each other. She took a step forward. Then, the sound of a single paw step echoed inside the shelter. Then another, and then a deep, familiar bark. Jessica turned just in time to see Rex explode forward from his kennel, his massive paws hitting the floor in rapid succession, his body moving faster than she had ever seen. His tail was raised, ears pinned forward, eyes locked onto one thing and one thing only. Luna. Jessica barely had time to react before Luna bolted, weak, trembling, but running toward him. She let out a cry, high-pitched, desperate, filled with everything she had been holding on to. And then they collided. Rex skidded into her, pressing his face against hers, his tail wagging so hard it shook his entire body. Luna whimpered, crawling closer, pushing herself against him, rubbing her muzzle into his fur as if she were trying to convince herself he was real. And he was. He was real. He was here. And he had never stopped waiting. Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The shelter was silent now. No barking, no shuffling, just the quiet, sacred moment of two lost souls finding each other again. Rex nuzzled her, licked her ears, sniffed her, checked every inch of her as if trying to memorize her all over again. And Luna let him. She melted into him, tail wagging weakly, her eyes half closed as she sank into the warmth she had been missing for so long. Jessica pressed a hand over her mouth, her vision blurring. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They had been ripped apart. They had suffered alone. But now, They were home. No more 10:17 p.m. whimpers. That night, as Jessica locked up the shelter, she walked past the kennels one last time. For weeks she had heard it, that soft, sorrowful whimper, that quiet call that Rex sent into the night, hoping for an answer. But now, the shelter was quiet. Rex was curled in his bed, Luna pressed tightly against him. Their breathing was steady. Their tails flicked every so often, small, content movements. For the first time since he had arrived, Rex was asleep before 10:17 p.m. Jessica exhaled, a slow, trembling breath. She had done a lot of good things in her life, but this was different. This was love that had survived the impossible. And as she turned off the lights, leaving them to rest, she knew nothing would ever separate them again. The night air was cool, drifting softly through the open windows of the shelter. The dim glow of the moon cast silver shadows along the floor, bathing everything in a quiet stillness. It was the kind of silence that, for weeks, had been filled with a single sorrowful sound, the soft, aching whimper of a dog who had lost everything. But tonight was different. Tonight, at 10:17 p.m., the shelter remained silent. For the first time since he had arrived, Rex did not cry. He did not lift his head and send his quiet call into the darkness. He did not press his nose to the air, searching for something that was no longer there. Because tonight she was beside him. Luna lay curled against Rex, her small, fragile body pressed into his warmth. She was thinner than before, weaker, but she was home. Her breathing was steady, soft puffs of air brushing against his fur. Rex shifted slightly, adjusting so that she fit more comfortably against him. His tail flicked once, a slow, contented wag. Luna's ear twitched at the movement, but she didn't stir. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were together. And together was all that mattered. Jessica stood just outside the kennel, watching them with quiet awe. She had seen many dogs find new homes, watched them run into the arms of loving families. But this was different. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a reunion that had defied time, pain, and distance. She could still remember the first time she had walked past Rex's kennel at night, hearing that heartbreaking sound, the whimper that came at the same time every single night like clockwork. At first, she had thought it was just grief, but now she knew better. Rex hadn't just been mourning. He had been waiting for a moment that had seemed impossible, waiting for the only family he had ever known. And now, he wasn't waiting anymore. Jessica exhaled, pressing a hand lightly against her chest. She had spent weeks trying to understand Rex, trying to find the missing piece of his pain. And she had. Now, as she looked at them, two souls who had found their way back to each other against all odds, she knew she had done something truly good, something that mattered. She stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb them. They deserved this moment. They deserved peace. As the shelter grew quiet for the night, Luna stirred slightly, shifting against Rex's side. He turned his head just enough to rest his chin over her, a quiet gesture of protection, of comfort, of love. For months, they had searched for each other in the darkness. For months, they had lived with the ache of something missing, something that had been torn from them without warning. And yet, through all of it, they had never truly given up. Even when the world told them to forget, Rex remembered. Even when everything felt hopeless, Luna kept going. And now, here they were. The weight of the past had not broken them. Instead, it had led them back to where they were always meant to be, together. Luna let out a soft sigh, pressing her nose against Rex's fur. His tail flicked once more. Then, with the quiet peace of knowing that they were finally home, Rex closed his eyes. And for the first time in so long, he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. 10:17 p.m. had come. and it had passed. And this time, Rex did not cry, because he was not alone anymore. The night was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rex did not cry at 10:17 p.m. No more desperate whimpers, no more longing calls into the darkness, because tonight, Luna was beside him. They had endured pain, loneliness, and fear. They had been ripped apart by cruelty, but they had found their way back to each other. Their love had survived, and in the end, love won. But this story isn't just about them. It's about all of us, about the strength to hold on, to keep believing, to never give up on the ones we love. As Maya Angelou once said, love recognizes no barriers. It jumps hurdles, leaps fences, penetrates walls to arrive at its destination full of hope. Here at Vale Marks, our mission is to share stories that touch your heart, that make you feel something real, something unforgettable. And we need your help to keep this dream alive. What do you think will happen next? Will Rex and Luna finally find the peaceful life they deserve, or is there still another challenge waiting for them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if you believe in the power of love and loyalty. Subscribe to Vale Marks and help us reach 1,000 subscribers, because your support is the reason we can continue creating meaningful, emotional stories like this one. Every new subscriber, every like, every comment, they all fuel this journey. So tell us, what did this story mean to you? Have you ever witnessed a bond as strong as Rex and Luna's? Let's keep this conversation going. Let's build a community that believes in the power of storytelling. Subscribe now. Let's reach 1,000 subs together. Because some bonds are unbreakable, and some stories, they deserve to be remembered.